Hi, it's Scott Vogel on sex addiction. I'm going to share with you the 6 major consequences of sex addiction. The disease of sex addiction often comes with some very severe and oftentimes damaging consequences. They include social, where the person just retreats from their social life. They emotionally have challenges with feelings and thoughts. Physically, they start to ignore their physical body. Many times they end up with legal challenges. The disease oftentimes drains financial resources and has an effect on the job when they're focusing all their time on their addiction, and this all leads to a damaged spiritual self. You see, the disease is a progressive disease, which means that it progresses and gets constantly more severe as time goes on, as the addict needs more. They have an obsession and a compulsion to increase their risky sexual behaviors. And when you progress to increased risky sexual behaviors, then the results oftentimes are extremely damaging. Now, some of the most common behaviors that are progressive and lead to risky behaviors start out with compulsive masturbation, viewing pornography, whether it's online, whether it's on a personal device, an iPad, a phone, DVDs, magazines. There's a plethora of available pornography in the world today. Then there's cybersex of different forms, whether it's talking on a chat, whether it's instant messaging, whether it's camera sex, cam to cam, a multitude of different ways for cybersex to sneak into the addict's life. Adultery, multiple partners and never being satisfied sexually, having phone sex, engaging in prostitution, visiting strip clubs, and adult bookstores. There's many more behaviors. These are the most common ones that sex addicts deal with. Now, the first consequence is the social consequences. The sex addict damages their social life by becoming distant to their loved ones. They draw away from all things that they used to do and spend more and more time in their sex addiction. They feed on the solitude of the addiction, and they find more ways to isolate themselves so that they can act out in their obsessive and compulsive unwanted sexual behaviors. They experience broken relationships with their partner or spouse. They experience strained family relationships and loss of friendships because they're focusing all their time, effort, and energy in their addiction. They lose sight of colleagues. The second consequence is the emotional. Emotionally, sex addicts face an uphill struggle. As they battle their addiction, they experience a broad spectrum of emotions. These range from stress and anxiety and guilt and shame and hopelessness and despair. These usually stem from the fear of being caught as far as the stress and anxiety. Now, as the addiction progresses, sex addicts engage in behaviors that fall out of their moral boundaries, things that they would say, I'll never do that. They start to creep into their boundaries and break the boundaries. And once they engage in some of these activities that they said that they would never do, the feelings of guilt and shame increase dramatically, which leads to the overall breakdown of the emotional health of the sex addict, because then they experience more shame and more guilt and more stress and more anxiety, and it just spirals into this never-ending cycle. For some people, these behaviors they'd never do, but for a sex addict, they just can't seem to stop. Boredom, for a lot of people, might be difficult to understand, but with a sex addict, there's a constant need to increase the intensity of their behaviors. They have to have more. It's kind of a disease of I want more, I need more, I have to have more when it comes to the sex. And if the addicts aren't able to intensify their activities, then they'll become bored and then they become frustrated. Then ultimately despair overcomes them because they're not able to stop these behaviors in spite of their desire to recover. So this whole boredom creates another spiral that increases their activities to act out, and then they get frustrated. When they're frustrated and stressed, then they have to medicate those feelings so they act out. So they need to get out of this spiral by working on their recovery with a trained sex addiction therapist, going to meetings, getting a sponsor, making phone calls. The third consequence is health consequences. Of course, sex addiction comes with very serious health risks and consequences. Of course, unprotected sex with multiple partners puts sex addicts at risk for sexually transmitted diseases, and additionally, sex addicts put themselves in dangerous situations to get their sexual gratification, picking up prostitutes, going to dangerous places, engaging in potentially illegal activities with underage children, with child pornography, all to achieve their sexual gratification. This is very common as the disease progresses and the need to intensify the behaviors increases. It ends up in lack of sleep, and the person then ignores their exercise regime, they ignore their proper nutrition, and for a lot stop taking their medications and just totally ignore everything in their lives for their sex addiction, which starts to ruin their health overall. Fourth are legal consequences. The compulsion to commit sexual acts oftentimes brings about some pretty serious legal consequences when the sex addict feels compelled to engage in unlawful activities. These can include sexual harassment, making obscene phone calls, stalking, exhibitionism, voyeurism, prostitution, online solicitation, child pornography, rape, incest, and the list goes on. You see, as the disease progresses and the sex addict regresses, he or she takes more risks to intensify the payoff of their sexually addictive behaviors. And for some, this leads to serious legal consequences. Consequence number 5 is the financial. Sex is a huge industry today worldwide. It's a multi-billion. The last statistic I heard at the SASH conference was in excess of $13 billion, and it's probably higher than that. So it's easy to understand how sex addiction can lead to serious financial consequences. Because engaging in activities like visiting strip clubs and soliciting prostitutes, purchasing pornography, paraphernalia, it's expensive. You know, pornography, they get the addict in for free, and then they get them hooked and they start paying money. Strip clubs are very expensive. Prostitution is, buying adult material at bookstores, adult paraphernalia, participating in webcams, going to adult sex clubs. These are all very expensive. Now, the list goes on. Combine these extra expenses that the sex addict starts to take on, and of course has to hide, with the poor performance at work. Now you add in the potential for financial trouble. A sex addict can face a downgrade in pay, and for some they lose their jobs because of poor performance or dereliction of duties, or even viewing pornography at work. The 6 consequences, which kind of is a culmination of the previous 5, is spiritual consequences. Sex addicts face severe spiritual consequences. Many people with sex addiction either have a loss of faith or no faith at all, which is the biggest challenge, and the 12-step program of recovery is all about a spiritual awakening. So if you have no spirituality, have lost it, it's kind of difficult to recover from this addiction. These people experience severe challenges with their self-worth. They don't feel that they're enough. They feel worthless. They feel lonely, resentment, self-pity, and self-blame, and they're very spiritually damaging. And they become progressive. The sex addict will minimize the consequences and blame others for some of the problems in their lives. But when they stop blaming, then the recovery begins. You see, the consequences can become the instruments for change. It usually takes somebody to hit a bottom in their lives before they decide to get serious about their recovery. And once they recognize it, then it's pretty tough to deny it anymore. So we talked about the social consequences of the addict totally retreating from family, friends, colleagues, partners. The emotional consequences of the extreme hopelessness, shame, guilt, stress, pressure, anxiety, and fear. The health consequences of potential risky behaviors and diseases and improper sleep, improper nutrition. The legal consequences for those that get involved in crossing their boundaries to illegal activities. The financial of spending way too much money on sexually related activities, losing potential jobs. And then, of course, the final spiritual consequences, which all lead up to the degradation of the spirit, of what we're all about, of our being. And sex addiction is a very spiritually debilitating disease. Visit our YouTube channel on sex addiction for more videos on sex addiction and recovery from sex addiction. Go to www.onsexaddiction.com for a free video explaining sex addiction, what sex addiction is, the 7 symptoms of sex addiction, the 4 traumas of sex addiction, the 4 faulty core beliefs set up by those 4 traumas of sex addiction, and the solution, the 7 paths of success in recovery from sex addiction. You'll also find more information about sex addiction and sex addiction recovery. This is Scott Vogel on sex addiction.